was doing and the work of PRA around the right wing. I think I walked past several discussions just in the time people were getting wine that where I heard Trump, 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 Trump. And we also know that we're operating in a state right now where we have a governor who's decided that dismantling public programs and that it's fine for poor people to not have services for a while. He's sort of strangling the population at this point, and we have no budget. We have no ability for social service organizations and agencies who are working with people to access money. It's a neoliberal strategy, and so we thought it might be appropriate to have Tarso come and Lynette and talk about this concept of neoliberalism. We sent out an article, it's like a study group. We sent out an article in advance for you to all read, and hopefully you had an opportunity to take a look at it. But if not, I think Tarso and Lynette are going to do a good job of interrogating it in front of us. But there's also PRA literature, the public eyes in the back. There's a whole issue on neoliberalism so that Jean's article is in, and other articles about the topic that I encourage you to pick up and take a look at, as well as other materials from Political Research Associates, which has been, for those of you who don't know, Political Research Associates is a social justice think tank that studies the entire spectrum of the right to support social justice advocates and defend human rights. So the work is very, very deep. It's been deep for many, many years, and it really does support people who are working in movements and people who are really trying to tackle these issues in a tangible way. It's a very important organization for all of us to support, and I really encourage you to pick up the materials and think, if you can, of writing them a check periodically, because as we all know, it's very expensive to print things, and they're writing and they're working and they're producing for us so that we can be ahead of the curve on these issues. So please think about that. But I want to start with the article that we asked you to take a look at is an article called Reading from the New Right to Neoliberalism, the Threat to Democracy Has Grown. And I'm going to read the definition of neoliberalism, which is right here in front of you, but I'm going to read it anyway. So neoliberalism is the economic, social, and political analysis that best describes the startlingly unequal distribution of wealth and power in the U.S. today. Neoliberalism and the policies it undergirds results from the triumph of capitalism and is sometimes called, quote, late-stage capitalism, unquote, or super-capitalism, unquote. So that's how Jean defines it in her article. I want to now more formally introduce the people who are going to be helping to lead our discussion. And like I said, we're going to start out with them, sort of laying some groundwork for us. But we really want to dig into this and see if we can get some dialogue going amongst the group here. So we're going to create space for that to happen. So keep your pencils poised with your comments and your questions. So I'm going to start by introducing Tarso Ramos, who you've met very briefly. Tarso has been studying and challenging the U.S. right for 25 years, contributing numerous articles and reports on Christian right, anti-immigrant, anti-labor, and anti-environmental movements and campaigns. Tarso has done this work in partnership with labor unions, women's groups, farm workers, human dignity organizations, and other social justice movements, principally in the Pacific Northwest. Tarso served as a founding director of Western States Center's Racial Justice Program and ran that organization's activist training capacity building initiatives. During those years, he collaborated with Jean Hardisty and Chip Brule of PRA, and in 2006, Tarso joined PRA as research director. 3 years later, he became PRA's executive director. So Tarso, please join us up here. And I'm going to suggest we move these closer because we don't have a microphone. And I broke my arm, so I
Yep.
the second person who's moving chairs now, so she has many skills, is...
You know what? Let's do the black chairs. I think it's hard to see from the back.
Oh, because these are low.
Yes, because they're low. Sorry, I had to explain.
All right, while they're moving the chairs, I'm going to introduce Lynette Aria Jackson, who is moving that chair. She's a professor of African history and gender and women's studies at the University of Illinois, Chicago, a consultant and expert witness on African political asylum cases, and a longtime human rights, LGBT rights, anti-racist, and transnational feminist activist and public educator. Dr. Jackson co-directs the Critical Diaspora Studies Initiative and has previously held the positions of Associate Provost of International Affairs and Chair of the International Studies Program at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Dr. Jackson is committed to creation and dissemination of knowledge towards the building of human empathy and understanding human rights and social justice. She is a board member of PRA and also a great supporter of the Crossroads Fund. So take it away.
Well, I'm really excited to be here. I think I might be the only one here who unfortunately never got to meet Jean. I actually joined the board of PRA less than a year ago, so Jean had already passed. So it's really humbling, and it's really an honor to be here tonight to really hear your people testifying about Jean as this amazing and transformative activist, researcher, scholar, organizer, institution builder, just an amazing legacy, and PRA is just part of that legacy. So Jean has said that this is really going to be an interview format. I'm going to be asking my fellow board member questions, and we're all going to talk about the article on neoliberalism. And we all know that Jean was committed and very prescient about her recognition of the serious threat that the rising right posed on American society, on democracy as we know it, imperfect but still, and also later, and this article is a testament to it, really understanding that in order to fight the right, we had to really take on neoliberalism as the contemporary and clear manifestation and expression of the right-wing attack on democracy. So we're going to talk about that article. You already have the definition, a working definition, and Tarso will sort of elaborate on that, give some examples and illustrations, and also talk about the work that PRA is doing. So Tarso, in the 35 years since Jean founded Political Research Associates, she wrote many sort of important and groundbreaking essays, and as Jean said, Mobilizing Resentment, which I think is a brilliant title, that really very well describes, I think, part of what's happening, today, and with the sort of populism of the Trumps, et cetera. I guess, why don't we just have you really give us some key arguments, or not even arguments, but some of the most important points that she makes in this article about neoliberalism. And, I think often, I'm a teacher, so I use neoliberalism a lot. I think a lot of people, at least on the left, use the term a lot. And we see eyes glaze over because while people are familiar with the term, they don't necessarily really know how to apply it or, when they see it, in action. And so we want to unpack that a bit. So maybe you could just start off by doing that.
Thank you. I think I was warned that this was going to be an interrogation, so if it's an interview, I'm already doing better than I planned for. I came braced. The setup felt a little bit like, that old William F. Buckley show, Firing Line. It sort of felt like we were going to play this role.
I've never been compared to William.
Only in your erudition. Only in your erudition, not in your politics. So actually, we're going to get into that, and I'm sure there are folks here who use this term and have their own ideas about exactly what neoliberalism means, and other folks who haven't really explored it, and so we'll hopefully have an interesting conversation. I actually want to start with a little story. The day after Jean's memorial service, almost a year ago in Somerville, Massachusetts, a number of us got together for brunch, and there were folks who'd come in from all over the country to honor Jean. And some of us, there were some old PRA alum who came in, and we thought, let's take advantage of this time, and what should we do with it? And some of us thought that one of the best ways we could think to honor Jean was to read the last thing she had published and have a conversation about what it meant for our work. And it was this piece, actually. So we had brunch, and I brought this piece, and we read portions of it, a passage of it aloud to each other, and we talked about what we thought it meant, and we challenged ourselves and each other to think about how to apply it in our work. And here we are tonight, doing a version of that. And how many of us have been at one point or other in a room with Jean having a conversation about the political moment and what must we do to address it? And a lot of hands. And so what a lovely thing that here, almost a year after her passing, this is what we're doing. And this, I think, is, for me, a big part of Jean's legacy. So I wanted to mention that. So a couple of things. Jean, as people know, Jean was really quite visionary in perceiving and anticipating a pretty fundamental shift, rightward shift in U.S. politics, back in the late 70s and early 80s, and dedicated herself to doing work to understand and expose it. And when she founded PRA, then Midwest Research, here in Chicago, she certainly didn't have any sense that 35 years later, however prescient she was, that this would be the state of the U.S. And so the backlash, the durability of the coalition the right has put together, its ability to mobilize and then aggregate power was beyond, I think, anybody's ability to perceive at that point. I remember Jean telling me that she had imagined this would be a 5-year, 10-year project tops, and really believed that with effective exposure of the agenda, the racism of it, the attack on the poor, that it just couldn't sustain itself. When exposed to that kind of a scrutiny, that this would collapse, and was tremendously disappointed, of course, that turned out not to be the case. I think that as she started that work with collaborators, Chip Roulette, a number of other people, she realized that the people in groups that she was studying were disregarded as sort of hillbillies and Bible thumpers and kind of marginal malcontents who couldn't really have an influence over the culture or the politics of the United States. And Jean perceived that that was wrong, in part because people were relying on outdated information about who these folks were and what their political project was about, including missing, for instance, shifts in right-wing theology that facilitated the reintroduction into public and political life of right-wing Christian evangelicals who had receded from public life at the times of the Scope trial. So there were these fundamental shifts that were taking place that very few people were paying attention to. And I bring this all up not just to honor Jean for this history, but because it was that attention to what is happening now. Let's not fight the last war. Let's not rely on outdated information about what the opposition looks like. It was such a hallmark of her work. And so my first comment is, I think that in this piece around neoliberalism, it's really Jean's attempt to hit the refresh button. After all this time, what level of power has the right been able to aggregate, and what is the front line of struggle at this moment? It's not that the backlash politics that are so well described in mobilizing resentment have gone away, and boy, in the year, and just in the last year, we've seen this incredible resurgence of mobilized and explicit bigotry. But it's not the only game in town. That strategy of using the formal mechanisms of democracy towards anti-democratic purposes to build and aggregate power has yielded a level of power that's now being wielded in some very different ways. The concentrations of power and wealth that have resulted in this country have allowed both the dismantling of some of these formal structures of democracy, be it the gutting of the Voting Rights Act or others, certainly the gutting of institutions that hold democratic process, the frontal tax on unions being just one example of that, but that have transformed, therefore, the nature of struggle. The ability to disregard even the formal structures of democracy, and as she points out in her piece, negotiate these international trade deals in secret without any kind of democratic participation, represents a fundamental kind of shift in the struggle that we face. So I think, again, there's this attempt in this piece to hit the refresh button and say, okay, really, what are we dealing with now? And the level of power that's been aggregated requires that we look at economic power and political power in some new and different ways.
Oh, okay.
Do you want me to
No,
launch into-
that's fine. One of the things that I think she points out in this article, and in other places as well, is the way that the institutionalization of right-wing ideology, you know, kind of like it is hegemonic, which we know, but I mean, even for those of us who think we see, often it's so entrenched and so institutionalized. I think about almost every day for some reason, and I don't want to offend anyone, I might right now, but when I'm driving my car, Marketplace is on. I don't know if anyone listens to that program on WBEZ. But I mean, to me, it's really an example of this kind of institutionalization of neoliberal ideology. And it's in such a, you know, a harmless manner, you know, it's just there, you know, but if you really listen to what's being said, this is neoliberal ideology. And so I guess, you know, I wanted to talk a bit about how, you know, we see but we don't really see, and that all attest to the ways in which it has really impacted our society. And it maybe if you could just give some examples, or maybe you don't know what I'm talking about, but you know, where it really has so deeply taken root. Yeah.
You know, I'm just old enough. I was born in 1967. I'm just old enough to have witnessed fundamental changes that began with the Reagan administration. And so the folks who are coming up and into this work, or just into the world in their lives in the United States, who are younger than me, have grown up under the beginnings of the imposition of a new economic and social order in the United States, and the imposition of neoliberalism. And so it is normalized, and increasingly normalized even for many of the rest of us who lived through some of those transitions. I guess what I want to, maybe what I'll do here is to jump into, you know, what are we talking about when we're talking about?
Well, let me just say one more other thing, because I mean, and this is sort of connected to that question, because another way to think about neoliberalism is like a form of free market fundamentalism, right? Like, you know, combined with the Christian fundamentalism, you have this compact assault.
Right.
So, yeah.
Well, so I would say, and my apologies to those of you who study neoliberalism as part of what you do. And I don't want to turn this into a clinic, but I think that it is, it's not a phrase that's part of the popular political discourse, right, in the United States, and not always even in progressive circles. So I do think it's helpful to unpack it a little bit. So I'll do my best with that. And Lynette is going to look for glazed eyes, and she's going to,
Okay.
you know, she's going to yank me with a cane if that happens. So I do think that the terminology is confusing, right? So neoliberalism, it's got this word liberalism in it, which doesn't have anything really to do with how most people in this country would use that term with respect to a political tradition that's grounded in either New Deal liberalism in the United States, or say the Great Society programs, or things that we would call civil rights liberalism, right, in the United States. But economic liberalism, of course, goes to classical economic theory, and it's this notion of the unfettered market. And it's also confusing, I think, because this notion of liberalism also has neoliberalism has nothing to do with the notion of the liberal consensus, right? This idea that gains in productivity, worker productivity as a result of mechanization and other things, are going to accrue to workers as well as to capital, as well as to businesses. That kind of social compact and economic compact, which began falling apart, especially with Reagan, arguably a little bit before, but certainly with Reagan's attack on the PACO workers and so forth. So where does this term come from? It's even further confusing because some of the folks who have most popularized or have championed neoliberal economics are neoconservatives. So, there's this alphabet soup, like, all right, so if you're a neoconservative, you're by definition almost a neoliberal. But if you're a liberal, you can't be a neoliberal, although unfortunately, increasingly folks who use that former label might espouse increasingly as kind of a neoliberal economic. So it is confusing. These terms are really confusing and they don't have a lot of purchase, right, in American political discourse. So I want to, first of all, I think it's helpful to separate the notion of political liberalism, right, which in the United States is grounded deeply in this tradition of civil rights and growing inclusion, from economic liberalism. And I think up into the period of Reagan, it was possible to be a little bit of both with this idea of the liberal consensus, where rising productivity, this notion that a rising tide lifts all boats. Maybe not all boats, but at least there was a compact. And the challenge was to get more of American society into that economic compact. For purposes of our discussion, I'd like to suggest it's helpful to think of there being four main elements of neoliberalism. And I think these are maybe more familiar, the terminology is more familiar to more people. Deregulation, austerity, privatization, and authoritarianism. And I'll say why authoritarianism goes with those first three. So I want to just give a few examples because I think this is the stuff that's more familiar to most of us. And this package in the Global South and outside of the United States, but particularly in the Global South, is understood as a package that people refer to as structural adjustment. For instance, we don't use that term so much in the United States, but I think it'd be fair to say we are undergoing now structural adjustment in the United States with all of these elements. So deregulation, and I'm going to use these terms pretty broadly because I think it's helpful to look at examples across a number of different communities and sectors and challenges. So for me, deregulation, it's useful to think of this in everything from union busting to deregulating the financial sector, and Glass-Steagall, which gives us then the mortgage crisis and wipes out wealth gains for lots of folks, and especially Black and Latino folks in this country, more or less overnight. Environmental regulations, if we look at the crisis that's happening now with the public water system in places like Flint, and deregulation in a variety of, in a campaign finance system. I think that Citizens United is another good example of this. So deregulation. Second is austerity. The notion that it's not plausible or not the role of the state to play a role in redistribution of the riches of the society. So cuts to education. We're here in Chicago, right? I'm in Boston, but we're reading the headlines, the closure of 52 schools, right, in this place. Cuts to social services going back decades now, the evisceration of the Great Society programs. So austerity. Privatization, including contracting out, which goes hand in hand with austerity. In many cases, it's the conversion of public services and public institutions into profit centers for private capital. The conversion of public education increasingly into private, in many cases for private charters, such as we have in Massachusetts, where I live right now. It's the conversion of prisons and the warehousing of people into profit centers, under the argument, in part, that the market does it more efficiently and cheaper, and in fact, typically less well and for a lot more money. So transferring the public sphere into profit centers for the private sector. And then authoritarianism, because the level of social and economic instability that are created by these structural adjustment policies require a very robust policing and incarceration system in order to manage the dislocation that inevitably results. So this, I think, if we think about, and we all could populate each one of these categories with many examples, and perhaps that's some of what we'll do tonight. I think if we think about neoliberalism, not limited to these dimensions. There are many other dimensions of neoliberalism, but these as being pillars of neoliberalism, it helps to bring what can be an abstract concept very clearly into focus in terms of our lives, in terms of our communities, places we live, in terms of the national challenges that we're facing right now. So let me pause there.
Okay. Well, I think that was a good place to stop. I mean, just in terms of these structures. And I was thinking that maybe we could relate this to some of the contemporary social movements, and perhaps, one of the key contemporary social movements today is the Black Lives Matter movement, or related movements against racist oppression in the United States. And I guess I'm wondering, I mean, and you already touched on it in terms of mass incarceration in the prison industrial complex, and how that sort of comes into play. But if you could maybe explicitly talk about the relationship between this neoliberal turn and, as you talked about before, the kind of mobilization of bigotry, but also just in that structural level that the Black Lives Matter movement is fighting against.
So, a couple of ways to come at what's obviously an enormous topic here. Actually, in this issue, and I do, the Public Eye magazine, which had Jean's piece, I do invite you to pick it up. There's another piece in here by Michael Omi and Howard Winan, who wrote Racial Formation in the United States, that I think is very helpful. It talks about the coevolution of colorblind racial ideology and neoliberalism. And the core argument they make is that it was necessary to dismantle the African American civil rights movement and the demands for economic restructuring that it presented in order to advance a broader neoliberal agenda. That at that moment in U.S. history, the greatest challenge to neoliberalism alongside the trade union movement was the African American civil rights movement and freedom struggle. And so there's an interesting coevolution of introducing ideas of neoliberalism in the United States that were introduced through racist scapegoating about who was deserving and who was undeserving, that justified the elimination of services, that justified the creation and wild expansion of the carceral state and a variety of the things that we now talk about. So structurally, there is this kind of coevolution, at least in some important dimensions. I think another way that we've been talking about this at PRA is that neoliberal economic policies have contributed to the social and economic instability of the country more generally. And that together with a sense of physical insecurity, the notion of the national security threat, the threat of violence that the right constantly talks about, that is both real and hyperbolic in its presentation with things like the shooting in San Bernardino, California, that sense of insecurity and the threat of ISIS, combined with economic instability and falling standards of well-being and living and wages, combined with very dramatic demographic change and shifts in social attitudes, create conditions that are very ripe for demagoguery, very ripe for an authoritarian kind of politic. And we see this internationally. We see this So going back to the Chicago School, I mean, here we are in Chicago talking about neoliberalism, right? With the Chicago School of Economics and Milton Friedman and these folks who began, ironically, championing this notion of neoliberalism as a hedge against authoritarianism, either in the fascist mode that we saw in Italy and Germany, right, during World War II, or in the Stalinist mode that we saw in the USSR. And yet there are places where they went to experiment with the imposition of this war, started with Pinochet's Chile, right? They haven't found a strongman or a caudillo, right, that they was willing to implement these policies that they didn't like. And in many ways, the neoliberal policies lend themselves and almost demand that kind of strongman politics. I think it's not coincidental that we see the rise of a Trump-like figure in the United States right now. And there's an interesting growing literature around the social psychology of authoritarianism that anticipates whether Trump is successful with his particular political aspirations right now or not, the rise of these kinds of authoritarian or caudillo kind of politics in the United States, given this conjuncture of race to the bottom economics, demographic change, in sense of precariousness in terms of national security. So I think all those things are coming together in ways that, despite Jean's focus on the economic piece, are inflaming the kind of racial backlash politics from the margins, the paramilitaries in Oregon, for instance, that stole my January, in terms of work that we're doing at PRA, to Trump. It's a very close continuum of politics that we're seeing now in that regard.
Okay, well, we want to open it up pretty soon, so I'm just going to make one comment and then ask the final question.
Sure.
The one comment is I think it's really important not to conflate, the right solely with like the Republican Party, and I think that's why Jean really talked about neoliberalism. I mean, certainly when we talk about a lot of the pillars of neoliberalism and, the threats to democracy today, many of them were actually authored under Democratic administrations, particularly, Bill Clinton. So I just think it's really important because I think sometimes when we talk about the right, we just assume we're talking about the Republican Party and somehow the Democrats are free of that. So I just wanted to make that comment. And then I guess the final question is just to give you an opportunity to talk about how PRA is, let's see what I wanted to say. Well, just how PRA's work, since Jean's passing, I mean, what are the projects of PRA? How are you continuing the work that she started, obviously, but also maybe some new directions that PRA is moving in?
Sure. And I appreciate the comment, and I think it is certainly the perspective that I read in Jean's piece that neoliberalism, if not hegemonic, I think Jean was very hopeful in this regard that our task is to not let it become hegemonic in the United States, is certainly, as you say, not contained within the Republican Party. It is the new Democrat sort of movement. The business Democrats are very much embracing of the neoliberal model. We see the trade agreements being negotiated right now, for example. So I would say a couple things on in terms of how Jean's work on neoliberalism is affecting the way that or influencing PRA's work. I think that, like Jean, the startling concentrations of wealth, the financial crisis, the erosion, the elimination of wealth for many communities virtually overnight, the Occupy phenomenon, a number of things has caused PRA to focus more on what Jean refers to in this piece as the Chamber of Commerce wing, right, of the right. So we've been, I think a lot of people are exposed to PRA's work in terms of what we publish. I think what's less visible to many people, unless you're actually working with us, are our partnerships with social justice advocates around the country that happen largely behind the scenes and sometimes are complemented with things that we publish publicly. But we are engaged in a lot more collaborations with worker groups, whether that's with labor unions or people who are organizing workers through worker centers or other kinds of formations, or just doing economic justice work. We're in a lot more partnership there. We've done a lot more work around how the Chamber of Commerce and other trade industry groups are attacking worker organizing in this moment. Similarly, doing a lot more work around the convergence between the Christian right agenda and the corporate right agenda, which we see manifest in legislation and in court decisions like Hobby Lobby, right? That on the one hand build on the Citizens United argument, and on the other hand expand this notion that conservative religious organizations should be exempt from civil rights law and put those things in the same package. Or the way in which the business right has long relied on the Christian right as a voting bloc. This is the what's the matter with Kansas sort of thesis, but has become much more sophisticated. The ways in which the Koch operation, for instance, is literally contracting with right-wing theologians to try to figure out how do you market 1% economics in a kind of Christian patina, right? How do we market this? To folks, conservative religious evangelicals who actually don't necessarily agree with this economic model. Like, how do we actually build this out? So we're doing a lot of work on that kind of convergence. We're doing a lot on the resurgence of white nationalism. We were working in Oregon for almost a year before this Harney County occupation took place. We were working with a group on the ground called the Rural Organizing Project, because we caught wind that this resurgence of patriot movement groups, many of which have direct antecedents in the 1990s militia movements, were kind of shopping around for fertile ground, as it were, for our confrontation with the federal government. So we started working with them, kind of mapping out the landscape in Oregon. So by the time the Malheur occupation took place, we kind of knew who was who. We were working with folks on the ground, trying to leverage their position with national media. So that's a big piece of our work. We're doing work with reproductive rights and justice groups around the country who are really thinking very hard about how to create a viable state-level infrastructure that can compete with the rights dominance in state legislatures, but actually, as a movement, don't have a very good assessment of what is the rights infrastructure. Like, why is the right so successful? What do they mobilize? So we're working with groups to do that kind of an assessment so they're in a better position to figure out, well, if we're going to contest with this, what kind of infrastructure do we need to go up against that? In the arena of immigrant justice, back in the summer of Trump, that unfortunately became the fall and Trump in the winter of some discontent, particularly perhaps within the Republican ranks, we got a call from immigrant justice groups to do some rapid-fire research for them on some of Trump's kind of business holdings to try to figure out some organizing points of vulnerability that wouldn't just feed the troll, right, in terms of showing up to Trump's rallies and protesting against him. So these are a number of just the projects that PRA is involved in with organizing partners around the country. But you can't be relevant in this moment without addressing the issue of the concentration of wealth and power that Jean in this piece refers to as looming oligarchy, right? A term that we use to describe, the political and economic arrangement in places like Russia. And Jean is challenging us to think about, what it looks like in the United States. When you have each candidate has their own super PAC, right? The Kochs are backing these folks, and the Las Vegas hoteliers are backing this candidate, and so forth. Increasingly, the balkanized kind of oligarchic politics in the United States resemble places that we critique around the globe. And yet, this is the society we're living in.
Could you, just about, I know I said I wasn't going to say anything else, but the one thing you didn't talk about is the really exciting work PRA is doing around globalizing culture wars. And I think just looking at how these are combining, the sort of neoliberal politics on the one hand, or processes on the other hand, and also the right-wing religious agenda. Just unusual marriage partner, but still they are very much interwoven.
Right. So, one note about neoliberalism as an economic model, it's very adaptable to a variety of different kinds of authoritarian regimes, some more theocratic, some less so. So whether that's, Modi's India or Iran or
Museveni's Uganda?
Museveni's Uganda, yes, very much so. And so, and interestingly enough, the U.S. Christian right is playing a very significant role as an international broker, both of this kind of economic model and of U.S.-style cultural war politics is a technique for power building, right? Not merely as a theocratic, ideology, but is a very successful way to divide the church community, for instance, in countries like Uganda, so that institutions that sometimes have housed the fiercest critics of autocratic regimes and corruption become aligned with those same regimes around the targeting of women's, bodily autonomy and the human rights of LGBTQ people. And so those techniques are being mobilized with tremendous effect around the globe. And PRA, it's a longer story, but PRA has ended up being a research leader around some of that work, happening particularly on the African continent. So we've documented a lot of that. We've broken some stories there. And we're working actually pretty closely with the feminist movement on the African continent and human rights organizers within churches to try to figure out how do you develop an affirming, liberatory counter-narrative within the church that can contest the play for monopoly on religious morality that's happening in Africa just as we've seen it happen in the United States.